So the name Micah means he who is like the Lord. He who is like the Lord. It seems that people saw qualities, values in Micah's life that they looked up to. Micah was the go-to guy in his village. He was a person of stature, a person of wisdom, a person of courage that people looked up to. And I think in each one of our lives there are people like that. People that we instinctively are drawn to. People that guided us in our growing up and helped us to become who we are. And there are qualities that we have to share as well. For we too are a peculiar treasure to one another. But Micah was special. He who is like the Lord. They saw the values and qualities that they felt were expressed in Scripture, that they thought would be the very nature of God, and they saw a reflection of that, an inkling of that in Micah's life. Micah was a prophet. And a prophet means a truth teller. And he spoke truth to power. That means he was always getting in hot water. He lived during the 8th century. It was a time of great turmoil, great unsettledness, great uncertainty. And the people of Israel, of which Micah was a part, at that time were broken into 2 kingdoms. The kingdom to the north, with Samaria as their capital, and the kingdom of Israel to the south, the people of Israel, with Jerusalem as its capital. They were all the tribe of Israel, but they had at that time 2 kingdoms with 2 different kings. In time, the Assyrian Empire, which were the big kids on the block, a ruthless empire, constantly throwing their weight around, overcame the capital of the northern kingdom, conquered their army, and all the people from the north fled as refugees to the south. At that time, Hezekiah the king, seeing that the Assyrians were coming next for them, began to build up the fortifications of Jerusalem to make their walls strong. And because Hezekiah was most intent in keeping the Assyrians out, he wasn't happy to see the refugees fleeing. He didn't have the time, he didn't have the resources to take care of these refugees, even though they were fellow Israelis. And so he built up the army. He built up the fortifications. He built up the wall that surrounded Jerusalem. And he kept his own people, the refugees fleeing from the northern kingdom. He kept them out to fend for themselves. It was an unsettling time for the people of Israel. It was an unsettling time for their king, Hezekiah. But Micah, the prophet, living in a frontier town 25 miles, which at that time was like being a world away from Jerusalem, Micah, from the vantage point of the frontier, began to look at what was going on. He saw refugees from the north coming to their frontier town, being brought into the homes of the people in that community. And he saw that happening all around Jerusalem, but that they were not allowed, Micah's own people from the north, allowed into Jerusalem. So Micah saw an enemy greater than the Assyrian Empire. He was concerned that the greatest enemy was the ethical collapse of his own people, especially the ethical collapse, the lapse of King Hezekiah. And so Micah began to read the riot act to his king. And kings don't like to be told what to do, right? Because they're the king. And there was Micah, along with other contemporaries, Isaiah, who was from the priestly class, and Hosea, and Amos, who famously said, "Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." These prophets were all speaking truth to power, speaking about God's heart for the vulnerable, for the poor, for the outsider, for the refugee. Micah spoke boldly in defense of the shepherds and the poor farmers whose lands were being taken by King Hezekiah and his friends. We hear these words.
And I said, "Listen, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces, and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron."
So if you're Hezekiah, you're probably not too happy to hear what Micah is saying. As in Micah's time, there's a passionate debate taking place in the halls of our government and on social media as to what kind of nation we want to be. I know on my Facebook feed there are all sorts of points of view, even from within my own family. Different perspectives as to what our government should and shouldn't do, as to what kind of nation we should or shouldn't be. We've been wrestling as a nation with questions like, is access to affordable, quality health care a basic human right? A friend of mine, a longtime friend, is a libertarian. He believes that the government has no role to play in mandating health care policy or to provide a social net, a safety net. He says it's up to each individual and their family to provide for themselves. And I respect my libertarian friend's perspective. But I think Micah would challenge him on the moral imperative to provide for those beyond oneself, beyond one's family, and even beyond one's tribe. The question that Micah and his people were wrestling with then, we wrestle with now. Do we have a responsibility to take care of those that we don't know, those that may at first seem different than us? What's going on right now with our debate around immigration and deportation? Specifically, do we as a people of faith have a responsibility for the well-being of 11 million of our undocumented neighbors? What would Micah say? What would Micah have us do? We have a banner outside our church that says, "Immigrants and refugees welcome." And there is a logo of the Holy Family, fleeing from Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph with the baby Jesus, because King Herod has said he will kill every child under 2 years of age, every male child. And so they fled to Egypt. And they lived there for 5 to 7 years, a little bit uncertain, until King Herod died. And it was free for them, safe for them, to leave their refuge in Egypt and to return to their homeland. And so we have this banner outside. And it's not uncommon for someone to take that banner at face value and come in to talk. A young man named Robert came to my door about a month ago. Robert is from the Congo. He grew up in a Baptist home in the Congo. He was raised there. He studied under the missionaries, and received a scholarship to go to college in the United States. And while he was studying, his family was murdered in the Congo. The Congo is considered the most dangerous country in the world. They've been in the midst of a civil war for over 20 years. And Robert was afraid to go home. And so, when his studies ended, he stayed illegally in the United States. It's been several years since he completed his studies, since his student visa lapsed. He married an American woman. They have a 2-year-old son. And he came in to talk with me about what his options might be, where he could turn to for guidance. Do we have a responsibility to the Roberts of the world? At the time of Micah, there were 2 competing narratives about what it means to be a people of faith. One narrative was rooted in the story of King David. David was the greatest king that the people of Israel had ever known, followed by his son Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, who built the great temple in Jerusalem. This narrative fueled the dreams of many kings who followed. And even as Israel was regularly conquered by neighboring states, many longed, like Hezekiah the king, to return to the days of power and influence. I think to a significant degree, there are many within the Jewish and the Christian tradition today that long to return to that time of glory and power. But that wasn't Micah. For Micah and the other prophets, faithfulness to God was not measured by the size of the army, the opulence of the palace, or the power acquired by the leaders. Micah's values were shaped by the narrative of Moses leading the people out of slavery in Egypt and wandering as refugees for 40 years in the wilderness until they came to their promised land. This story of slavery, of oppression, of being refugees fueled the imagination and the heart of Micah and Isaiah and Hosea and Amos and the other prophets, to the point where they were called to speak truth to power and to stand with their most vulnerable sisters and brothers. Yet Micah, for all his indictments against his nation's leaders, also had the message of divine forgiveness and hope. He spoke for the restoration of the temple and the salvation of his people. Micah, reflecting the voice of God, reminds Israel of how again and again God rescued and was faithful to them as they remembered to be faithful to God.
O my people, what have I done to you? And what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam son of Beor answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord.
And then this question is asked by Micah to the people as to what is really important.
With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?
And Micah answered, no, I don't want your fancy worship services. I don't want your power and your influence. This is what I want.
He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?
To do justice, to practice fairness and equity for those who are like us and those who are different, to ensure a good and fair playing field for everybody. Justice. And to do kindness. The word kindness at its root is related to the word compassion. And the word compassion means to suffer with another. It's different than sympathy. When we are sympathetic towards another, we write a get well card or a word of condolence. But when we have compassion, we enter into the pain and suffering of another, where their pain becomes our pain. Remember when your child was awake at 3 a.m. with a fever that wouldn't break? And how you would have done anything to take their pain upon yourself if only you could? Compassion is to enter into, in a very deep sense, with the pain and the suffering of another, one who is your own kin, and as Micah would say, the one who is also the outsider. And to walk humbly with your God. It calls for humility before God, dependence upon God, to seek to reflect as best we can the heart and the values and the very essence of God. The God, Micah would say, who led the people out of oppression and slavery, who walked with them for 40 years as refugee from camp to camp, being pushed out and shunned by the neighbors, by the neighborhood that was already in place, by the tribes and the nations that were already there. God accompanied you. Now you too, says Micah, are to walk humbly with your God. So that was then, the time of Micah. The northern kingdom had collapsed. The refugees had flowed into the southern kingdom. What would the people of Israel do? Would they build a bigger wall, grow a greater army like King Hezekiah? Or would they welcome and embrace the outsider as a sister and brother? The reason we tell these stories that are over 2,000 years old is because these stories have legs, and they are our story today. And over the course of human history, this cycle of refugees and what to do and whether to embrace or whether to push out has been part of the human condition, a choice for each generation, it seems, to make. In about a half an hour, 10 minutes after worship, in the lounge, right at the end of this aisle, we're invited to have a conversation, to prayerfully ask, what would God have us do in response to 11 million undocumented neighbors? We will discuss the story of Francisco Rodriguez, who fled violence in El Salvador in 2006. He came to Boston, where his sister lived. He applied for political asylum, citing the violence in his native country. But that application was denied in 2009, and when appealed in 2011, it was also denied. But still, the federal authorities recognized his situation, and each year, since 2006, when he dutifully goes before the Immigration Board, he has been allowed to remain for one more year. In the meantime, he is married. He has 2 children who are U.S. citizens. His wife is currently pregnant with their third child. He works 16 hours a day, running a carpet cleaning business during the day where he employs people, and working as a custodian at night at MIT in Cambridge. I just want to take care of my children, Francisco says. He employs people, he pays his taxes, he has no criminal record. Each year, he has dutifully applied for an extension of his stay. Each year, it was approved until this year. This past week, Francisco was detained in a county jail in preparation for deportation, and tomorrow, his appeal will be heard. What would Micah have us say? What would Micah have us do? What does justice and kindness look like for Robert from the Congo, who lives right here in Beverly, and Francisco, who lives with his family in Chelsea and works in Cambridge?